My name is John Boll. I'd like to welcome you here to another one of our luncheon briefing briefing sessions. I am with the Prince Albert Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And I have the pleasure of being the moderator and chair, which I interpret as being the boss of the session. And it's one of those interesting tasks. This is a little bit more difficult as an being moderator and an introducer than normal, because among other things, I have large stacks of printouts from many years ago from our speaker for today, and I didn't go through them to find what sorts of things we could talk about. But Dr. DeLong-Bas was not Dr. DeLong-Bas when I met her first. She was sort of sitting back there in one of my classes. She is one of the products of the history department and the center's programs that we are exceedingly proud of. She has sort of a long connection with Georgetown. She was essential in operating certain kinds of programs, and especially was a big help to me when I was chair of the program for the American Historical Association, and she was my assistant. However, what she started when I first met her, what she wanted to do was to look at the whole tradition of what is called Wahhabi fundamentalism, and to do something that really had not at that point been done in an appropriate way, of actually starting by saying, what did Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab actually say? What did he actually write? Rather than what did people say about what he wrote. And so that she, in a very thorough way for her dissertation, became, I think, one of the foremost experts, not just here, but in the world, given the fact that the Saudis also invite her to come and talk. She is the author of an immediately forthcoming book, The Struggle for the Future of Saudi Arabia. She left the 18th century and is working in the 20th century. She has done, her dissertation became the book Wahhabi Islam from Revival and Reform to Global Jihad. Natana has the curse, shall we say, of being very efficient and very reliable, which also means then that in addition to having written 3-4 books now and edited other things and so on, whenever places like Oxford University Press need somebody who is really efficient and will get things done, they ask Natana to do it. And so when we wanted, for example, looking at what she's currently working on, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, looking for the Arab Spring, when we wanted to have something that would be kind of oriented towards Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, we conscripted Natana. And welcome home, Natana.
It is always a pleasure to come back home, and a bit daunting in this particular case to be invited back to someplace that's very near and dear to my heart. And just so you all know, I did come very well prepared. I'm not going to stand here and read 74 pages of paper to you, but what I wanted to do is perhaps shake up a little bit and think outside of the box with respect to the events of the Arab Spring and why it is that Saudi Arabia alone seems to have missed out on the massive kinds of protests over corruption and authoritarianism and government accountability that seem to have swept much of the rest of the Arab world over the past year. And when we're talking about Saudi Arabia, sometimes we just have to look at the issues a slightly different way. We're talking about a country that has long suppressed any sort of overt public demonstration. Indeed, the government reiterated its ban on public demonstrations in March of 2011 in order to discourage people from engaging in such activities, because it's just not the way things are done in the kingdom. There are other mechanisms in place, we are forever being told. It's interesting that there were some attempts at protests and demonstrations. We certainly heard a lot here in the United States about the Day of Rage that was supposed to happen on March 11th. And there were a lot of phone calls came in, asking just how big this event was going to be. And I said, well, probably not very. I wouldn't get too excited about it. And indeed, even though the media gathered, there was one lone person who showed up with a placard to kind of march around and raise his voice about his concerns about the lack of democracy. In talking to a number of Saudis, what I was told was that there were really two reasons behind the lack of support for these kinds of public protests. One is that it's considered to be very gauche to go out marching around in the streets. It's just not the way things are done. And the second was that people felt that it was relatively pointless, that it was not bound to accomplish anything useful or productive. The majority of the Saudis actually do have some, at least, respect, if not affection, for the current king, and they were not interested in overthrowing the monarchy in the same way that Egyptians were interested in getting rid of Mubarak, or in Tunisia, getting rid of their leader. We did see some protests, and there are some that have been ongoing, specifically in the eastern province where the Shia minority lives. And Saudi Arabia has long had a complicated history with its Shia minority, really only turning a corner since September 11th. There had been some efforts to try to engage that population, but nothing done at a particularly serious, or we could even say national level, until after September 11th, when the kingdom had to come to terms with the reality of Takfiri ideology, and the reality that Takfir was not just being applied to those outside of the kingdom, but there were issues within the kingdom as well in terms of dealing with difference of opinion with respect to religious issues. And I would point to one of the main events that really helped to start to change the dynamic as having occurred several years before the Arab Spring. And that would have been in the National Dialogue of 2005 that began to address the question of the religious other at a more serious level. And for the first time, we had Shia religious leaders who were invited to participate in that conversation, along with some of their Sunni counterparts. In part because of this, there has been greater openness for public practice of certain Shia rituals, particularly Ashura celebrations, and development projects have been planned in areas that had been previously neglected. And by 2000, iron fist policy. To make it clear that the ban against public demonstrations will be upheld, and they consistently refer to protesters as criminals and deviants. However, they do sometimes also add in blame for foreign elements, which we have to understand obviously refers to Iran, for supposedly stirring up and supporting these different protests. As charges were filed against the accused who attacked the police station, the charges that were issued against them were very specific: instigating riots, disrupting traffic, destroying public property, shooting at police, and using innocent people, namely civilians, as human shields. What was interesting, and perhaps a bit different this time around, though, was that care was taken not to taint the entire Shia population in the process. It was made clear that these were particular individuals, a small group of people, in the words of the Interior Ministry, who did not categorically represent the innocent, loyal citizens of the region, but rather these were a very specific group of people who were purportedly working to implement a foreign agenda. And just as interesting was the fact that a group of scholars and tribal leaders from Qatif made a point of getting together and going to visit the governor of the Eastern Province to make it clear that whatever the concerns were about those who had been arrested, they wanted to be clear that they were rejecting violence as the means of achieving that. They also wanted it to be clear that they would reiterate their allegiance to the Saudi leadership because they were concerned about losing everything that they had gained in working cooperatively with the government up until this point. What they wanted to be certain of was that this was not going to deteriorate into yet another ugly incident of sectarianism, and so they chose to frame their own feelings and approaches in terms of patriotism, their loyalty to their country, and their responsibilities as citizens. There were some who did not support this particular approach. In particular, they protested against the right of the government to confront the rioters, to which the Interior Ministry responded that when being attacked, security forces do have a right to engage in legitimate self-defense as the situation demanded. Nevertheless, deep appreciation was repeatedly, publicly expressed by for those Shi'is who adopted clear and explicit stances against the use of violence in favor of dialogue. These are the kinds of protests and demonstrations that we have tended to focus on here in the West because of certain political dynamics. But there are some other kinds of protests and demonstrations that I think may prove to be more significant in the long run in terms of social change, particularly those that suggest a new development in youth culture and in looking for other than violent government responses in solving problems. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about events that have occurred over the last 2 weeks in March of 2012. Protests about university conditions at some of the universities for girls. And this began on the campuses of two of King Khalid University's women's colleges. One is the College of Education, and the other is the College of Literature. There were about 50 female university students who were injured during protests, and this incident was reportedly sparked when a guardian of one of the students had driven away some of the cleaning workers. And what that caused was an accumulation of garbage in the university. Students began to allege that cleaning operations had not been properly undertaken, and that even though they had attempted to lodge their complaints with the appropriate officials, the supervisory officials were arrogant and refused to listen to their concerns. The situation was so bad that when the students tried to go to the cafeteria, they literally had to walk on top of mounds of garbage just to access the areas needed. Other complaints included poor classroom conditions. There weren't enough chairs in the lecture halls. Some complained of abuse and poor treatment by faculty members and administrative officials. And some even reported that the water taps had been closed, as well as the cafeteria. What the students wanted was a total change in this situation. They said they were fully aware of their rights, not only as students, but also as Saudi citizens. And so they began gathering in front of college buildings and protesting. When their protests for a cleaner environment were not met, they escalated their demands. And what they began to demand were an inquiry into allegations of corruption against the president of the university. They began to vandalize university property at that point, and so fire extinguishers and water hoses were brought out and used against them. 22 students were ultimately admitted to hospitals and another 31 treated on campus. This was not simply a matter of campus security having to deal with this, but the police, the civil defense, the health department, and the Red Crescent, as well as members of the HEA, the Commission for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, were called in to the disturbance. Parents also started to come into the university to try to protect their daughters. Bless you. And finally, the Asir governor, Prince Faisal bin Khalid, was forced to come to the university himself and order an immediate investigation into the issues. When he first arrived, he adopted the standard language of security. He said anybody attempting to tamper with the country's security would be dealt with firmly. country has no place for gatherings, sit-ins, and demonstrations, but he said that the genuine demands of the students would be met. And in keeping with the standard royal family approach, he reassured everyone of his personal availability. If they had demands or criticisms, they could go to his office. He was willing to open his home, his phone lines to people so that they could present their complaints in a systematic manner. In other words, what he wanted to avoid was chaos and the eruption of emotions. That official rhetoric did tie these protests into security matters and sedition, which we know the country will deal with an iron fist, because the Interior Ministry tells us that all the time. However, there was a new element to this. The royal family had to step in and show leadership in taking control of the situation, investigating the incident, talking with the conflicting parties, and trying to find a way to determine solutions. In this particular incident, they could not simply sweep the issue under the rug or keep it out of the media. Why? Because we have these wonderful means of social media communications that are capable of live broadcasts. And other students heard about this, and others have been inspired to do similar things. The Women's College of Art in Mahia in Asir Province and Bureda in Qasim Province have also demanded changes in university regulations, better infrastructure, and better academic environment. But they learned something from this prior experience, and that was that they had to be very careful about how they were going to frame the issues. So the first thing they did before they presented any of their demands was to reassure their loyalty and obedience to the rulers, to make it clear that they were not challenging the political authorities, but they were making demands that were related to their education and to their living conditions. Some of their requests were very simple: installing shade umbrellas on campus to protect them from the sun, freedom to buy meals outside of the college, allowing students who were in the teaching program to do their student teaching in schools that were close to their homes. And the rector of the university rewarded them for using this respectful approach, assured them that Prince Faisal Al-Khalid was very eager to meet these demands, and encouraged them to continue to present their demands in an orderly and peaceful manner. They weren't asked to stop. They weren't told to go home. They were encouraged to continue, but to do it appropriately. And a similar thing happened at Qasim University. What these incidents highlight to us is that there are both appropriate and inappropriate ways of making demands known, of getting attention to issues, and most importantly, of pushing officials to be accountable, even in the kingdom, and to respond to demands. And I also have to note that it's very interesting that the agents and activists in question in these cases are female university students. I have to wonder if a group of males would have gotten the same response. We often hear that being female in the kingdom is a real disadvantage, but if the government is serious about protecting women and assuring their safety and well-being, they were able to box the government into a corner on this one by forcing them to respond to demands that affected their quality of living. That would be something relatively new. And what are the women students getting out of this? They're demonstrating in a very practical way their ability to organize, to decide for themselves what their problems are and how they should be solved. They've made their voices heard, and they haven't just made them heard, they're getting the results that they want. And so I think this is something to watch in the months and years to come, to see how these successes and initiatives in leadership for community problem solving play out in broader society in the days and years to come. So there's one theme with respect to the Arab Spring, protests and demonstrations. What about the role of social networking and freedom of expression? It may help to know that these incidents at King Khalid University did not arise out of a vacuum. Social networking had previously been involved in raising awareness about appalling university conditions at another girls' university, the University of Hail for girls. There was a student there who had posted pictures of a university building in very poor shape on her Facebook account. And for her efforts, she was suspended. However, many of her classmates responded to this by sending tweets out on Twitter. And thousands of people picked up on this, and so these images that originally had been limited to Facebook were now being sent out through Twitter. And they showed, indeed, that the condition of the building was such that it represented a danger to the lives of the students and staff, particularly as the rainy season approached. And so there were all sorts of arguments that broke out about the university's actions. Did the university have the right to suspend this student for raising awareness about an important safety issue? And tweets ran along the lines of these sorts of comments. They don't consider it abuse to force students to study in this collapsing building, but it's abuse when the student exposes the building's condition. Some people really do have very strange mentalities. Citizenship is supposed to be an anti-corruption tool. That student should have been thanked, not suspended. And in the words of one, it's an utter shame when a college student cannot enact change. How will they ever learn to produce positive change later on? In other words, if you don't begin with change where you are now, how can you hope to accomplish anything further out or further on? It wasn't just Twitter. An anonymous group of students also got together to put together a blog campaign, urging people to take action to stop suspension of this student. As far as they were concerned, all this young woman did was post pictures to share her concerns with her Facebook friends. And they felt that this issue was a legitimate one because just a few weeks before there had been a major fire at a school in Jeddah and a number of students were killed. That fire had been set accidentally by students who were playing around in the basement, and when the fire actually started to spread, instead of notifying people, which is what they should have done, they got scared, were afraid they were going to get in trouble, and so they just left the basement and went back to someplace else, and unfortunately the fire spread. And this raised many questions. For how long are people going to be expected to remain silent when public safety is at issue? And so there were debates that went on not only on Twitter but also on this blog about whether students broke the rules by taking pictures and posting them, or whether the safety issues really were such that they needed to be addressed. In the end, within one day, the suspension of that student was lifted, and she was reinstated to the university, and the General Directorate of Civil Defense was pressured to form a specialist and safety commission to go in and actually investigate the circumstances on the university campus. And so what that incident proved to many people is that social networking, whether we're talking about Facebook or Twitter, provides a powerful call for action that governments are no longer able to censor or control. That's very much in keeping with the lessons of the Arab Spring in other places. And when you add smartphone applications and BlackBerry messengers and the WhatsApp application that allow instant messaging, it also suggests to us that the days when government bureaucrats can simply hide behind their desks and either pretend they never heard about the issue, or they can say one thing and then later deny accountability or say, well, you know, I never really said that, it's over. Social networking is very widespread in the kingdom. According to a recent study done by Fawzia Al-Harbi, Saudi Arabia's Facebook community is actually the second largest in the Arab world and the 32nd largest globally. There are 2.9 million users. Almost half of them are young men and women under the age of 25. So we have this theme of youth coming to the surface. YouTube has also proven to be particularly popular in the kingdom. It has been found to be the fastest rising search term on Google during 2011, followed by Facebook and Hafiz, which is a national program that helps people who are looking for jobs in the kingdom to find them. Twitter ranks 5th, Al Jazeera 7th, and Al Arabiya is 9th on that list.